Khalil The Heretic. Part 1. Sheikh Abbas was looked upon as a prince by the people of a solitary village in North Lebanon. His mansion stood in the midst of these poor villagers, huts like a healthy giant, amidst sickly dwarfs. He lived amid luxury, while they pursued an existence of penury. They obeyed him and bowed reverently before him as he spoke to them. It seemed as though the power of mind had appointed him its official interpreter and spokesman. His anger would make them tremble and scatter like autumn leaves before a strong wind. If he were to slap one's face, it would be heresy on the individual's part to move or lift his head or make any attempt to discover why the blow had come. If he smiled at a man, the villagers would consider the person thus honored as the most fortunate. The people's fear and surrender to Sheikh Abbas were not due to weakness. However, their poverty and need of him had brought about the state of continual humiliation. Even the huts they lived in and the fields they cultivated were owned by Sheikh Abbas, who had inherited them from his ancestors. The farming of the land and the sowing of the seeds and the gathering of the wheat were all done under the supervision of the sheikh, who, in reward for their toil, compensated them with a small portion of the crop, which barely kept them from falling as victims of gnawing starvation. Often many of them were in need of bread before the crop was repeated, and they came to Sheikh Abbas and asked him, with pouring tears, to advance them a few piastres, or a bushel of wheat, and the sheikh gladly granted their request, for he knew that they would pay their debts doubly when harvest time came. Thus, those people remained obligated all their lives, left a legacy of debts to their children, and were submissive to their master, whose anger they had always feared, and whose friendship and goodwill they had constantly but unsuccessfully endeavored to win. Now, if you're finding people who don't follow the good of the Bible, who aren't a good example of the Islamic teachings, it can make sense that you would end up being a Baha'i. Part 2. Winter came and brought heavy snow and strong winds. The valleys and the fields became empty of all things except leafless trees, which stood as specters of death above the lifeless plains. Having stored the products of the land in the sheikh's bins and filled his vases with the wine of the vineyards, the villagers retreated to their huts to spend a portion of their lives idling by the fireside and commemorating the glory of the past ages and relating to one another of the tales of weary days and long nights. The old year had just breathed its last into the gray sky. The night had arrived, during which the new year would be crowned and placed upon the throne of the universe. The snow began to fall heavily, and the whistling winds were racing from the lofty mountains down to the abyss and blowing the snow into heaps to be stored away in the valleys. The trees were shaking under the heavy storms, and the fields and knolls were covered with a white flower, with a white floor upon which death was writing vague lines and effacing them. The mists stood as partitions between the scattered villages by the sides of the valleys. The lights that flickered through the windows of those wretched huts disappeared behind the thick veil of nature's wrath. Fear penetrated the fellahins' hearts, and the animals stood by their mangers in the sheds, while the dogs were hiding in the corners. One could hear the voices of the screaming winds and thundering of the storms resounding from the depths of the valleys. It seemed as if nature were enraged by the passing of the old year and trying to wrest revenge from those peaceful souls by fighting with weapons of cold and frost. That night, under the raging sky, a young man was attempting to walk the winding trail that connected Der Kizhaya with Sheikh Abbas village. Sheikh Abbas's village. Der Kizhaya is one of the richest, most famous convents in Lebanon. Kizhaya is a Syriac word meaning paradise of life. The youth's limbs were numbed with cold, while pain and hunger usurped him of his strength. The black raiment he wore was bleached with the falling snow, as if he was shrouded in death before the hour of his death had come. He was struggling against the wind. His progress was difficult, and he took but a few steps forward with each effort. He called for help and then stood silent, shivering in the cold night. He had slim hope. Withering between great despair and deep sorrow, he was like a bird with a broken wing, who fell in a stream whose whirlpools carried him down to the depths. The young man continued walking and falling until his blood stopped circulating and he collapsed. He uttered a terrible sound, the voice of a soul who encountered the hollow face of death, a voice of dying youth, weakened by man, and trapped by nature, a voice of the love of existence in the space of nothingness.